The wall of brown water came down Coyote Wash before Ida Bancroft ever heard it coming, and by the time she reined her mare up short at the canyon's lip, the bridge that had stood there for 6 years was nothing but broken timbers spinning in the flood. She sat the saddle with her black bag lashed behind the cantle, and her heart, hammering harder than the horse's hooves had a moment before. Behind her, somewhere on the road from Ruby Flat, the messenger boy was still catching his breath from his ride to fetch her. Ahead, across a quarter-mile of churning brown water, lay Silver Gulch, and in Silver Gulch, in a two-room shack behind the stamp mill, a young woman named Sarah Whitfield was trying to bring a child into the world feet first. "You are not crossing that," a man's voice said, low and even, from somewhere off to her left. Ida turned. A stranger stood near a picketed gelding, a canvas satchel of tools at his feet, a coil of rope over one shoulder, and an expression on his face that suggested he had already decided the argument was over before it began. He was tall, sun-browned, with the kind of forearms that came from years of hard, honest labor, and dust from the trail still clung to his dark hair. "I have to cross it," Ida said. "There is a woman on the other side who will die, and likely her baby with her, if I am not there within the hour. Then we will find another way across, because that water will take a horse and rider both and swallow them whole." He was already walking the bank as he spoke, eyes on the water, on the rock shelves, on the way the flood surged and pulled at the canyon walls. "I have been surveying this wash for 3 days for the county contract. There is a rock ford upstream above the old mine cut where the canyon narrows and the water runs shallower over bedrock. It will still be ugly, but it will not be a drowning. And who are you to know that better than I know my own patient's need for speed?" "Joseph Garrison," he said, swinging up onto his gelding without slowing his pace. "Carpenter, bridge builder. And I have pulled 2 mules and a wagon out of flash floods in my life, ma'am. So if you would rather trust your instincts to a wall of brown water, I will not stop you, but I would rather not watch you die today." Ida Bancroft had delivered 41 children in the mining district in the past 3 years, had set bones and stitched wounds and sat with the dying, and she had learned in all that time to recognize a man who was telling her the plain truth because there was no time for anything else. She wheeled her mare after him. "Ida Bancroft," she said, as they rode hard along the canyon rim, the flood roaring below them like something alive. "Midwife. And if this ford of yours drowns me, Mr. Garrison, I will haunt you the rest of your days." "Then I suppose I had better not let that happen," he called back, and there was, even in the danger of it, something almost like a smile in his voice. The ford, when they reached it, was no gentle thing. The water ran chest-high on the horses, fast enough to stagger a lesser rider, and Joseph took Ida's lead rope in his fist and kept his gelding upstream of her mare the whole crossing, breaking the worst of the current before it reached her. Twice her mare's hooves slipped on the unseen rock beneath, and twice Ida felt her stomach drop toward her boots, and both times Joseph's voice cut through the roar, steady as a man reading scripture, telling her where to look, where to lean, when to let the horse have its head. When they came up dripping on the far bank, Ida was shaking, but she was dry from the waist up and her bag was still lashed tight behind the saddle, and Sarah Whitfield's shack was less than a mile distant. "You did not have to come the rest of the way," she said, as they rode into Silver Gulch, past the stamp mill grinding away at its endless work, past miners who stopped to stare at the woman soaked to the thighs and the stranger riding beside her. "I built that ford crossing today by finding it," Joseph said. "Seems only right I see whether it was worth the trouble." It was worth the trouble. Sarah Whitfield's baby came 2 hours later, turned at the last by Ida's steady hands and steadier voice, crying loud enough to be heard over the mill itself. And Joseph Garrison, who had come intending only to boil water and stay out of the way, found himself holding a lantern at Ida's shoulder while she worked, watching her fingers move with a competence that struck him as its own kind of beauty. When it was over, When Sarah lay pale and exhausted with her daughter against her chest, her husband Ezra weeping openly in the doorway, Joseph stepped out into the cool October evening and found his hands would not stop trembling, though he told himself it was only the Ford's chill still in his blood. "Mrs. Whitfield," Ida said to Sarah's mother-in-law, an older woman who had been holding candles and cloths all evening, "you have a fine granddaughter." "Amos would have loved to see her," the older woman said, wiping her eyes. "God rest him." Joseph, standing in the doorway, felt the name land somewhere behind his ribs like a stone dropped down a well, though he could not have said why, not yet, not with the Ford still roaring in his ears and Ida Bancroft's exhausted, radiant face still filling up his whole field of vision. They rode back to Ruby Flat in the gray hour before dawn. The flood receded to a sullen brown trickle, the sky lightening pink over the eastern ridges. Neither of them spoke much. There was a comfort in the silence that surprised them both, the particular ease of two people who had faced danger together and come out the other side still standing. "You are a strange sort of carpenter, Mr. Garrison," Ida said finally, as Ruby Flat's scattered lights came into view, "to know a flood crossing better than most rivermen." "I have crossed a good many rivers in my time," he said. "Never had much reason to stay near any of them long enough to call them home. And now," he looked at her sideways, and something in his chest tightened at the frank curiosity in her face, the way she looked at a man as though she meant to actually hear his answer rather than merely wait for her turn to speak. "Now," he said slowly, "I have a contract to build the county a proper bridge. Stone footings. Iron reinforcement if the freight wagons can bring it up from Carson City in time. A bridge that will not wash out with the first hard rain. I have built a great many things in my life, Miss Bancroft, but I have never built anything meant to last more than a season or two before the next town needed me somewhere else. And you would like this one to last." "I would like," Joseph said, surprising himself with his own honesty, "to build something once in one place and then still be standing beside it in 20 years. Ida said nothing more until they reached the edge of town, but she was smiling, faintly, in the growing light, and Joseph Garrison found that he wanted very badly to know what she was thinking. Ruby Flat, when the sun came fully up, revealed itself to be a town caught neatly at harvest, wagons piled with squash and dried corn rattling down its one street, the smell of wood smoke and drying apples heavy in the cool morning air. It was smaller than Silver Gulch and older, a farming town that had grown up around the one spring in 20 miles reliable enough to water orchards and hay fields, and it fed the mining camp below with more than water. Every wagon load of cabbages and side of dried beef that went down the canyon road went to feed Silver Gulch's miners, and every dollar of mill wages that came up the same road bought Ruby Flat's harvest. It was, Ida explained over coffee at the boarding house that morning, an arrangement that had worked well enough for years, until Dalton Crane bought the Silver Gulch stamp mill 18 months back and began looking at the spring above Ruby Flat with an acquisitive eye. "He says the mill cannot run through the winter without more water than the flume currently carries," Ida said. "He says our orchards waste water that could be crushing more ore and paying more wages. He has been saying it at every town meeting since spring, and now, with the bridge gone and the road half ruined, he means to say it louder. And the town council, split," Ida admitted, "half believe him about the wages. Half remember whose grandfather dug that spring channel by hand 40 years ago, before there was a Silver Gulch at all." She looked at him over her cup. "My Uncle Everett is one of the ones who remembers. He has farmed here since before the war. He would sooner dig the flume up himself and haul the water down the mountain in barrels than sign it over to Dalton Crane." Joseph turned his own cup slowly in his hands, watching the steam rise. "And you, Miss Bancroft, what do you believe?" "I believe," Ida said, "that I have delivered babies in both towns, and buried a few in both towns too when the water ran short or the fever came, and I do not think either town can survive by starving the other. But I have not yet heard Dalton Crane propose anything but taking, Mr. Garrison, and taking is not the same as sharing." It was, Joseph thought, watching her, a fair and careful answer, the kind that came from a woman who had learned to think before she spoke because lives depended on it, and he found himself liking her more for it, which was a dangerous thing to feel about a woman he had known less than a day. The county's contract had him building the bridge with lumber and labor paid half by Ruby Flat's town fund and half, uncomfortably, by Dalton Crane's mill money, since the mill depended on the road as much as the farms did. Joseph spent the better part of the next 2 days laying out stone footings on either bank of Coyote Wash with a crew of 6 local men, measuring and remeasuring the span, sinking pilings into bedrock the way his father had taught him 30 years before in Missouri, back when Joseph had been young enough to think a man's hands could build his whole future without his past ever catching up to him. He saw Ida often in those 2 days, crossing paths with her on the road as she made her rounds, sharing a meal at the boarding house table, once helping her carry a crate of medical supplies up from the freight office when the county's supply wagon finally made it through the rebuilt Ford. Each time the ease between them deepened, the banter growing quicker, the silences growing more comfortable, until Joseph found himself inventing small reasons to walk past the boarding house in the evenings, and Ida found herself, though she would not have admitted it aloud, listening for the particular rhythm of his hammer on the wash below her window. On the 3rd evening, Ruby Flat held its harvest fair, an event that happened every autumn once the last of the hay was in, and the cattle buyers had come up from the valley to make their bids. Lanterns were strung between the wagon yard's fence posts, a fiddle and a guitar struck up a reel, and half the town turned out in whatever finery it owned, farmers and their wives, a handful of Silver Gulch miners who had ridden up for the evening, children chasing each other between the legs of the cattle penned for tomorrow's sale. Joseph arrived scrubbed clean of sawdust, in a shirt he had pressed as best he could over a hot stone, and found Ida standing near the punch table in a blue dress that made something in his chest go tight and foolish. "You dance, Mr. Garrison?" she asked, before he had gathered the nerve to ask her himself. "Poorly," he admitted, "but I am willing to risk your toes for the privilege." She laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, and put her hand in his. They danced 2 reels, and then, when the fiddle slowed into something gentler, a waltz that Joseph managed with more care than skill, his hand at the small of her back, her face tilted up to his close enough that he could see the small scar above her eyebrow, could smell the lavender water she had dabbed at her wrists. "Where is home, Joseph Garrison?" she asked quietly as they turned beneath the lantern light. "Truly, not the last town you built a bridge in. Where were you born?" "Missouri," he said. "A little town on the river that does not exist anymore, more or less. My father built the church there. I helped him raise the steeple when I was 14. I thought I would spend my whole life in that town. What happened?" Joseph was quiet a moment too long, and Ida felt it, the way his hand tightened almost imperceptibly at her waist. "The war happened," he said finally, which was true, though it was not the whole truth, and both of them seemed to sense the door closing on the subject even as he said it. "And after the war I went looking for work wherever the railroads and the mining camps needed a man who could build something solid out of green lumber and bad plans," he said. "I have not stayed anywhere longer than a season since. Until now, perhaps." "Until now," Ida repeated softly, and for a moment beneath the lanterns, with the fiddle sighing through its last notes, Joseph thought he might tell her everything, might finally say the words he had carried alone for 8 years like stones in his saddlebags. But the song ended and the moment passed, and he only bowed over her hand instead, feeling like a coward and grateful for it in equal measure. They were still standing near the punch table, not quite ready to let the evening end, when Dalton Crane arrived. He came on a fine black horse, flanked by 2 men Joseph did not recognize, and though he smiled and tipped his hat to the assembled townsfolk with the easy charm of a man used to being listened to, there was something in his eyes, cold and assessing, that made the fiddle music seem to falter, just slightly, at his approach. "Fine evening for a fair," Crane said, dismounting near the wagon yard fence. "I hope you will all remember, come the town meeting Thursday next, that Silver Gulch buys near every bushel of squash and side of beef this fair has to sell. A mill that cannot run through the winter is a mill that cannot buy anything at all. A farm that cannot water its trees is a farm that cannot grow anything to sell you, Mr. Crane," said an older man near the fence, gray-bearded, broad through the shoulders despite his years. Ida murmured to Joseph that this was her Uncle Everett Bancroft. "No one is asking you to stop watering your trees, Everett," Crane said smoothly. "Only to share what is, after all, God's water and not Ruby Flat's private property. That spring was dug by hand by men who are buried in this town's cemetery," Everett said. "I do not recall God's name on the deed, Mr. Crane, but I recall my father's." There was a ripple of low agreement through the crowd, and Crane's smile thinned, though it did not disappear. His eyes moved briefly to Joseph, and then to Ida standing beside him, and something calculating flickered there before he turned it back to charm. "We will settle it Thursday like reasonable men," Crane said. "In the meantime, enjoy your fare." He remounted and rode off toward the boarding house, his two silent riders falling in behind him, and one of them, a lean man with a scar through one eyebrow and a way of watching a crowd like a man counting his enemies, looked back once at Joseph with an expression that made the hair on Joseph's neck rise, though he could not have said why. "Who is that man?" Joseph asked quietly. "The one who rides at Crane's left hand." "New to the mill this month," Ida said. "Calls himself Rourke. I do not much care for the way he looks at people." Joseph filed the name away, though he did not yet know why it mattered, and the fair went on around them. But something in the evening's warmth had cooled, and Joseph found himself watching the road long after Crane's party had disappeared down it. That night, while Ruby Flat slept off its fiddle music and cider, someone opened the headgate of the upper flume and jammed it wide with an iron bar, letting 3 days' worth of the spring's carefully hoarded flow roar down the wrong channel and out onto the rocks below the orchard, wasted entirely, the reservoir behind the diversion dam left half empty by dawn. Joseph was among the first to reach the flume when the alarm went up, alongside half a dozen furious farmers and Everett Bancroft himself, white with rage at the sight of the ruined headgate and the dry channel where his apple tree's water should have been running. "This was no accident," Everett said, crouching by the bent iron bar. "That gate does not open itself, and it surely does not jam itself wide with a prybar that walked here on its own legs." Joseph examined the marks in the mud around the gate, the boot prints leading up from the canyon trail, and felt a cold certainty settle into his stomach. He had tracked men for a living once years ago, and the habit of reading ground had never quite left him. "2 men," he said, "came up from the Silver Gulch Road sometime after midnight. One of them favors his left leg, walks with the weight on the outside of the boot." "Rourke," Ida said, arriving breathless with her bag, having been fetched to tend a farmhand who had cut his hand badly trying to force the gate shut again in the dark. "The man at the fair. He favors his left leg. I noticed it when he dismounted." Everett Bancroft's jaw tightened. "Crane means to make it look as if we cannot manage our own water, so he has an excuse to take the managing of it away from us entirely." "We cannot prove Rourke did this," Joseph said. "Not with boot prints alone. A judge will want more than that." "Then we will have to find more than that," Ida said, and there was iron in her voice that Joseph had not heard from her before, iron that told him this fight had become personal for her in a way it had not been 3 days ago. That afternoon, tending the farmhand's cut hand in the boarding-house kitchen, Ida heard him mutter, feverish and half out of his senses from the pain and the laudanum she had given him, something about the mine man's money and just the gate, nothing more. And when she pressed him gently for names, he said, before sleep took him under, "Crane. Told Rourke to do it quiet." Ida carried that news to Joseph at the bridge site that evening, finding him alone, working late by lantern light on the new footings, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat and sawdust clinging to his forearms. "It is Crane," she said without preamble. "Behind the flume and likely behind whatever else goes wrong between now and Thursday's meeting." Joseph set down his hammer. "I am not surprised, only sorry to hear it confirmed." "There is a wanted notice come up with the Mail Rider today," Ida went on, "for a man named Silas Rourke. Robbed a Wells Fargo strongbox off a stage near Austin this past spring, shot the guard, though the man lived. Reward of $400 dead or alive, posted by the Territorial Marshal's office. The description matches Crane's man to the letter, down to the scar through his eyebrow." Something in Joseph went very still. "Rourke," he repeated. "You know the name?" "I knew of a Rourke gang years back," Joseph said slowly, "when I did different work than carpentry. Small outfit, worked the roads between Austin and Eureka. I never caught any of them myself. But I know the sort of men who ride with a name like that." Ida studied his face in the lantern light, and something in his careful stillness made her ask, quietly, "What sort of work, Joseph?" He looked at her for a long moment, and Ida watched something close behind his eyes, a door swinging shut, and it was not the first time she had seen him do it, and this time it settled into her like a small, cold stone. "I will tell you," he said finally, "when I have found the courage to say it properly. Not tonight, not with Crane's business hanging over the whole town." "I have found," Ida said, "that men who say that rarely find the courage later than they would have found it now." "Then I will have to prove you wrong," Joseph said, and though he meant it as something gentle, almost teasing, Ida heard, beneath it, a weight he was not yet ready to set down, and she left him at the bridge site with a troubled heart, though she did not yet know why. Thursday's town meeting was held in the largest building Ruby Flat possessed, the grain warehouse near the mill, its doors thrown open to let in the cool evening air, lanterns hung from the rafters, half the town packed onto benches and crates and standing along the walls. Dalton Crane arrived with Rourke and his other man flanking him, and Everett Bancroft stood at the front with a half-dozen other farmers, and Ida sat near the front beside her uncle, and Joseph stood at the back near the door, close enough to watch the whole room. Crane made his case first, smoothly, reasonably, speaking of jobs and wages and the good of the whole district, and for a moment Joseph watched several faces in the crowd soften toward him. The way people will soften toward anyone who promises them money is the simple answer to a hard problem. Then Everett Bancroft stood, and beside him, unexpectedly, Ida rose as well. "Before this town signs away water that feeds every orchard and well between here and the county line," Ida said, her voice carrying clear across the warehouse, "I would ask Mr. Crane to explain why the man who opened our headgate Monday night and jammed it wide with an iron bar wears his boots exactly like the man standing at his left hand right now." The room went very quiet. Rourke's face did not change, but his hand drifted slowly toward his hip, and Joseph, watching from the back, moved without quite deciding to, drifting closer along the wall. "That is a serious accusation, Miss Bancroft," Crane said, his charm gone thin and cold. "I trust you have proof, and not merely a farmhand's fevered ramblings." "I have a wanted notice," Ida said, "posted by the Territorial Marshal, for a man named Silas Rourke, robbery and attempted murder near Austin this past spring, matching your hired man's description down to the scar over his eyebrow. I have a farmhand who heard your name spoken alongside his the night the flume was sabotaged. And I have 30 years in this valley telling me that a man who needs to break something before he can buy, it is not a man dealing honestly." The warehouse erupted into noise, farmers shouting, a few of Crane's mill supporters shouting back, and in the chaos Rourke's hand finished its journey to his hip, and steel flashed in the lantern light, and Joseph was already moving, already closing the distance, and he caught Rourke's wrist and drove it upward hard enough that the shot, when it came, buried itself harmlessly in the rafters, scattering dust and splinters down over the crowd screaming. It took 4 men to wrestle Rourke to the floor and disarm him properly, Joseph among them, his knee planted between Rourke's shoulder blades, And in the sudden ringing silence that followed, Crane's second man had vanished out the back door into the dark, and Crane himself stood pale and furious near the front, insisting loudly that he had known nothing of any of this, that Rourke had acted entirely alone. "You will forgive us, Mr. Crane," Everett Bancroft said grimly, "if this town does not find that easy to believe." They held Rourke that night in the grain warehouse's storeroom, the door barred and a farmer with a shotgun set to watch it, while word was sent by fast rider to Eureka for the circuit marshal, who was not expected for 4 or 5 days at the soonest given the distance and the state of the roads. Joseph, his knuckles split from the struggle, found Ida outside the warehouse afterward, wrapping a cloth around his hand with hands that shook only slightly now that the danger had passed. "You knew about the wanted notice," he said, "and you stood up in front of the whole town and said it aloud, with Rourke standing armed not 10 feet away." "I had a fair idea he was armed," Ida said. "I did not have a fair idea he would draw on a room full of witnesses. You could have been killed. So could you, catching his wrist like that." She tied off the bandage and did not let go of his hand right away. "Why did you move, Joseph? You were nearest the door. You could have gone for help instead." "There was no time," he said simply, "and I have spent a good part of my life learning to read the exact moment before a man reaches for his gun. I did not think. I only moved." "You have spent a good part of your life reading men who mean to draw on you," Ida repeated slowly. "That is not a carpenter's skill, Joseph Garrison." He looked at her, and this time he did not look away, though it cost him something visible to hold her gaze. "No," he admitted. "It is not." It was Amos Whitfield's brother, old Caleb Whitfield, who told her the rest of it 2 days later, entirely by accident, while Ida sat with him tending a chest cold in his small cabin at the edge of Ruby Flat. He spoke, as old men will, of the past unprompted, of his brother Amos who had farmed here once before moving down to try his luck at Silver Gulch's mill, of the terrible year 8 years back when a posse of bounty men out of Eureka had shot Amos dead on the road, mistaking him for a horse thief he had never been, only to discover afterward, too late for anything but grief, that the real thief had been caught 2 counties over the very same week. "They never answered for it," Caleb said bitterly. "Bounty men rode in, bounty men rode out again, $400 richer for a mistake, and left my brother's widow with 2 children and a debt on the farm. That family only just now, with Sarah's little one born safe, feels like it has come up whole again." Ida sat very still, her needle stopped halfway through its stitch, a terrible cold certainty climbing up through her chest. "Do you recall," she asked carefully, "the names of any of the men in that posse, Mr. Whitfield?" "Only one," Caleb said. "The young one who led the tracking, the one folks said had the sharpest eye in the territory for reading sign. Garrison, I believe his name was. Joseph Garrison." Ida finished the old man stitching with hands that had gone perfectly, professionally steady, the way they always did when her heart was breaking somewhere underneath, and she did not say another word about it until she found Joseph that evening at the bridge, the stone footings nearly finished now, the first timbers of the span laid across in a skeleton that would soon be a road again. "Amos Whitfield," she said, without preamble, standing at the canyon's edge with the wind pulling at her skirts. "Sarah's father-in-law, the man whose granddaughter I delivered the night we met, on the very night you first crossed this wash with me. Caleb Whitfield tells me a posse killed him 8 years ago, chasing a horse thief he never was. He tells me the man who led the tracking was named Joseph Garrison." Joseph set down his level slowly. He did not try to deny it, and something in Ida almost respected that, even through the anger rising hot behind her ribs. "It was me," he said quietly. "I was 25 years old, and I had a reputation for reading trail sign nobody else in 3 counties could match, and I was proud of that reputation. God forgive me. We tracked a stolen horse to the road near his farm. He ran when we called out because he was frightened, because 4 armed strangers came riding up on him at dusk, and we shot him before he'd gone 40 yards, and I told myself for a week afterward that a guilty man runs and an innocent man stands his ground, and I believed it, because believing it let me sleep." He looked up at her and his eyes were wet, and he did not try to hide it. The real thief was taken 2 days later in Eureka, still riding the actual stolen horse. Amos Whitfield had bought a gelding that same week from a trader, who did not know it had passed through a rustler's hands a year before. He died for the crime of an honest purchase, Ida, and I collected $40 of the reward money for helping run him down, and I have not touched a bounty in 8 years because I could not live with the sound my own conscience made every time I tried. "And you did not think," Ida said, her voice shaking now, "that I ought to know this before I stood in a warehouse defending a bounty notice to your face, before I let myself dance with you, before I let myself begin to hope that you were a man I could trust with anything at all?" "I was afraid," Joseph said simply. "I have been afraid for 8 years that if anyone truly knew what I did, they would look at me the way I look at myself in a shaving mirror. And I did not want to see that look on your face, Ida, because somewhere in these few days I have come to care very much what you think of me." "Then you should have trusted me enough to let me decide that for myself," Ida said, "instead of deciding it for me, the way Dalton Crane decides for this whole valley what water it may and may not have." She was crying now, angry at herself for it, angry at him for causing it. "I buried children in Silver Gulch that fever took because a doctor 2 days out couldn't be paid to hurry. I have made my whole life out of arriving before it is too late, Joseph. I cannot love a man who arrives with half the truth and calls it whole." "Then I am asking you," Joseph said, "to let me arrive with the rest of it, even now, even late. I am not the man who rode away from that road 8 years ago without looking back. I have spent every year since trying to build something that could not fall down on someone the way my carelessness fell down on Amos Whitfield. I do not know how to undo what I did. I only know how to try to become a man worth forgiving." Ida did not answer him that night. She turned and walked back toward town in the last gray light, and Joseph did not follow her, because for the first time in 8 years, he understood that some things could not be chased down and made right by a man's own hurried effort alone, and that Ida Bancroft, of all the people in this valley, had earned the right to decide in her own time whether his effort was enough. He worked alone at the bridge until well past dark that night, driving spikes by lantern light until his shoulders screamed, and it was there, past midnight, that he heard a horse coming hard down the Silver Gulch Road and found Ezra Whitfield, Sarah's husband, wild-eyed and breathless, reining up at the canyon's edge. "Rurks escaped," Ezra gasped. "Overpowered the man guarding him not an hour ago, stole a horse, rode for the canyon. Crane's other man is with him. Marshall Hayes from Eureka is still 2 days out. Everett Bancroft's gone after them alone, Mr. Garrison, on account of the Flume Gate again, and I fear he means to try and stop them by himself." Joseph was already saddling his gelding before Ezra finished speaking. The moon was 3/4 full, enough light to ride by if a man knew the canyon, and Joseph did know it now. Every ledge and wash and collapsed mine at it he had walked and mapped in the 2 weeks since the flood, and he rode hard into Coyote Canyon with his heart pounding out a rhythm that was equal parts fear for Everett Bancroft and a fierce, focused clarity he had not felt since his bounty hunting days. The old skills rising up in him, not as shame now, but as the only tool sharp enough for what the night demanded. He found Everett's horse first, riderless, grazing nervously near the canyon's narrow throat, and then, following the sound of raised voices echoing off the rock walls, he found Everett himself, pinned down behind a boulder while Rurk and Crane's other man, a lean gunman named Barlow, fired down at him from a rock shelf above, pinning him in a cross of moonlight and shadow with nowhere safe to run. Joseph did not ride in shouting, the way a lesser man's instinct might have told him to. He had built this canyon's bridge with his own hands. He knew its ledges the way he knew the calluses on his own palms. He left his gelding tethered in a stand of pinyon well back from the fight, and climbed instead, quiet as a hunting cat, up the old mine trail that switchbacked behind the rock shelf where the 2 gunmen crouched, a trail that had been cut 60 years before by prospectors and long since fallen out of any map, but the one Joseph had walked with his surveying chain 3 days past. He came up behind Barlow in the dark and took him by surprise entirely, a hard blow that dropped the man before he ever got off a shot, and Rourke, hearing the scuffle, spun with his pistol swinging wide, firing wild into the dark, the shot sparking off rock a foot from Joseph's head. "You should have stayed in that storeroom, Rourke," Joseph called out, moving low and fast along the ledge, using the broken ground the way he had once used it tracking men for a living. "There's a marshal coming from Eureka with your name on a warrant. Running only adds to the list of charges. There's $400 on my head already," Rourke snarled, firing again, closer this time, close enough that Joseph felt the wind of it. "One more charge won't hang me any deader." "Then you should know," Joseph said, dropping flat behind a shelf of rock as another shot cracked past, "that I've hunted better men than you through worse country than this, and I know this canyon in the dark better than you know it by daylight." He came at Rourke from an angle the man never expected, up through a collapsed adit shaft that connected the old mine trail to the rock shelf itself, a route no stranger to this canyon would ever have guessed existed, and he was on Rourke before the outlaw could turn his gun, driving him down hard against the rock, wrestling the pistol free, and pinning the man's arms behind him with the same rope he had carried for surveying work not 3 days before. Below, Everett Bancroft emerged from behind his boulder, unhurt but shaken, calling up into the dark, "Garrison, Garrison, is that you up there?" "It's done, Everett," Joseph called back, breathing hard, his hands scraped raw, Rourke cursing and struggling beneath his knee. "Barlow's down and tied. Rourke's caught. Bring the horses up if you can manage it." It was near dawn by the time they got both prisoners back to Ruby Flat, tied hand and foot across saddles, and the whole town seemed to spill into the street at the news, farmers and their wives crowding around, Everett Bancroft telling anyone who would listen how Joseph Garrison had come up out of that canyon like a man born to it, taking 2 armed men without firing a shot of his own. Ida was among the crowd, her face pale in the gray morning light, and when her eyes met Joseph's across the street, something passed between them that was not yet forgiveness, but was no longer quite anger either. She came to him an hour later, after the prisoners had been resecured in the warehouse storeroom under a heavier guard, finding him at the pump behind the boarding house washing the canyon's dust and blood from his hands. "Everett says you knew that canyon better than a man could know it in 2 weeks, Ida said. "Says you came at them from a trail nobody in this valley remembers exists." "I have spent a lifetime learning to read country other men overlook," Joseph said. "It is the same skill, Ida, whether I use it to hunt a man wrongly or to save one rightly. I cannot give the skill back. I can only choose now what I do with it." Ida was quiet a long moment, studying him. "You went into that canyon alone at night for a man you barely know. Everett Bancroft is your uncle," Joseph said simply. That was reason enough. Something in Ida's face softened just slightly, though the hurt of 2 nights before had not fully gone from her eyes. "I am not ready to say all is forgiven, Joseph Garrison. What you did 8 years ago cost a family everything, and no canyon rescue undoes that." "I do not ask it to," Joseph said. "I only ask for time to earn it properly, the slow way, the way I should have offered you the truth from the start." "Then earn it," Ida said, and though her voice was still cool, there was, for the first time since Caleb Whitfield's confession, something in it that sounded almost like hope. The circuit marshal, Hayes, arrived from Eureka 2 days later than expected, delayed by a broken axle on the mail coach, and by the time he reached Ruby Flat the whole affair had assembled itself into a case as clean as any frontier court could ask for. Rourke's wanted notice matched to the flesh, Barlow's confession, given freely once he understood Crane meant to let both men hang for his own scheme rather than risk his own neck, and Caleb Whitfield, Everett Bancroft, and a dozen farmers ready to testify to the sabotaged flume gate, and the mill owner's threats at the harvest fair. Dalton Crane was arrested in his own office at the stamp mill, protesting loudly that he had known nothing of Rourke's methods, only to have Barlow's signed statement produced before the whole assembled crowd, naming Crane explicitly as the man who had paid for the Flume Gate sabotage and promised both hired guns a bonus if Ruby Flat's counsel could be pressured into selling the water rights before the season's end. The trial, held 2 weeks later before a traveling territorial judge in the Eureka County Courthouse, was swift and, by the standards of the frontier, entirely orderly. Crane was convicted of conspiracy and destruction of property, and though the mining district's own economic dependence on his mill spared him a longer sentence, he was fined heavily, stripped of any claim to Ruby Flat's spring, and barred from holding any water rights in the county for a period of 10 years, a judgment that Everett Bancroft called with grim satisfaction, as close to justice as this valley is likely to see in my lifetime. Rourke, for his part, was held over for trial in Austin on the older stage robbery charges, the $400 reward duly confirmed as payable to whoever had made the capture, pending the paperwork the marshal promised to file within the week. It was the morning after Crane's arrest, with the warehouse still buzzing with relief and the town beginning, cautiously, to breathe easy again. That word came down the canyon road that would change everything Joseph thought he understood about how the next hour would go. Marshal Hayes had ridden up to the land office that morning to settle accounts before continuing on to Austin with his prisoners, and he called Joseph in personally, laying out on the plank table before him a stack of bills, worn and honest, $400 exactly, counted twice for accuracy. "You made the capture clean, Mr. Garrison," Hayes said. "Both men, no shots fired that hit their mark, no unnecessary harm done even to the guilty. Wells Fargo's reward is yours by right, and I'll not hear any argument otherwise." Joseph stood looking down at the money, at $400 that would buy him, finally, after 8 years of wandering from one town's bridge to the next, an actual plot of land in Ruby Flat, lumber enough to build not a job's worth of construction but a home, his own home, the first he had owned since Missouri. He had his hand halfway to the stack when the door burst open and Ezra Whitfield stumbled in, pale and shaking, having run the whole way from the boarding house. "It's Sarah," he gasped. "The babies took a fever, bad, worse than anything Doc Malone up here knows how to treat, and Ida's gone down to Silver Gulch to see her. But there's word the fever's spreading fast among the little ones down there, some kind of camp sickness. And Ida sent word up she needs quinine and carbolic from the county stores, and needs it before nightfall, and Deacon Riley's wagon threw a wheel on the canyon road not 20 minutes past. And there's nobody else who knows that road well enough to get a horse through the wash crossing fast in failing light." Joseph did not look at the money again. "Which crossing?" he said, already moving toward the door. "The new bridge or the old ford?" "Bridge ain't decked yet past the center span," Ezra said. "You'd have to use the ford, and it's running higher than it is all week, on account of the rain up in the hills last night." "Then I know that ford better than any man alive," Joseph said, and he was out the door before Marshal Hayes could say another word, swinging up onto his gelding bareback in his haste, leaving $400 sitting untouched on the plank table behind him, the bills fluttering faintly in the draft from the open door. He rode for the canyon at a hard gallop, and it was there, at the edge of town, that he found Ida herself, not yet gone, mounting her own mare with a satchel of medical supplies from the boarding house's small stock, her face set with the particular grim determination he had come to know so well in the short time he had known her. "You cannot cross that ford alone in this light," Joseph called, reining up beside her. "The rain last night will have it running faster than the night we first crossed it together." "I do not have the luxury of waiting for daylight, Joseph. There are children down there with fever climbing by the hour." "I know," Joseph said. "I am not asking you to wait. I am telling you that you are not crossing it alone." Ida looked at him, something complicated moving behind her eyes, the memory of every unresolved word between them still hanging in the air. And then, seeming to decide that this was not the moment for old arguments, she only nodded once sharply and said, "Then keep up, Mr. Garrison." They rode into the canyon together as the light began to fail, the wash running high and brown just as Joseph had feared, the current stronger than it had been even on that first desperate morning. And Joseph led them upstream past the new bridge's unfinished span to the same rock ford he had found weeks before, his eyes reading the water for the safe line through it with the same practiced care he had once used to read a fleeing man's trail. Only now, at last, in service of something he could be wholly proud of. "Stay above me," he called to Ida over the roar of the water, "and if your mare stumbles, let go the reins and grab for my arm, not the saddle horn." "I know how to cross a ford, Joseph." "I know you do," he said. "I am only telling you that I intend to be there if you need me, and I would rather you knew it before the water gets loud enough to drown out the words." Something in her face changed at that, softened in a way he had not seen since the night of Caleb Whitfield's revelation, and though there was no time to say more, Joseph carried the look of it with him all through the crossing, through the cold shock of the water rising to his thighs, through the moment when Ida's mare did stumble on a loose rock and Ida, exactly as he had asked, grabbed for his arm instead of the horn, and he held her steady through 3 long strides until the mare found its footing again. And they came up on the far bank together, soaked and shaking and entirely, wordlessly certain of each other in a way they had not quite managed to be with words alone. Silver Gulch, when they reached it in the last gray light of evening, was a town in quiet crisis, 6 households with feverish children, Doc Malone overwhelmed and grateful nearly to tears at the sight of Ida's satchel of quinine and carbolic acid, and Ida worked through the night without pause, moving from house to house, sponging fevered brows, dosing children with careful, practiced hands, and Joseph worked beside her wherever a strong pair of hands and a steady presence were needed, boiling water, holding frightened children still for their medicine, carrying messages between houses, and somewhere in the long hours of that night, watching her work with the same fierce competence. He had admired the very first night they met. Joseph understood with complete and simple clarity that he loved her, not as a passing fancy born of danger and proximity, but as a settled, permanent fact, the same way he knew a well-built bridge would hold. By dawn, the fever had broken in every household but one, and by mid-morning, that last child, too, a boy of 3 belonging to a blacksmith's family, was sleeping peacefully with color returning to his cheeks, and Ida sat back on her heels in the small cabin single chair, exhausted beyond words, and looked up to find Joseph standing in the doorway watching her with an expression she had never seen on any man's face before, something raw and unguarded and entirely without pretense. "You left the bounty money on the table," she said quietly. "Ezra told me before we crossed. $400, Joseph, sitting there for the taking, and you rode out without so much as counting it twice." "I did not need to count it twice," Joseph said. "I only needed to know which mattered more, and there was no contest in it at all, Ida, not for one single second." Ida rose, crossing the small room to stand before him, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion and the tenderness both written plain across her face. "8 years ago you told yourself a story about who you were, and it cost a man his life. Last night you told yourself a different story, and it cost you $400 and nearly cost you a ford crossing in the dark. And I think, Joseph Garrison, that the second story is a far truer measure of the man standing in front of me now than the first ever was." "Does that mean," Joseph asked carefully, "that I have earned some small measure of what I asked for, standing at the canyon's edge?" "It means," Ida said, "that I am no longer certain I was ever truly capable of not loving you, once I understood the whole of you, faults and all. I only needed the whole of you offered honestly, and I have it now, I think, offered about as honestly as a man can manage while soaking wet and half-drowned in a canyon ford." She kissed him then in the small doorway of the blacksmith's cabin, with the fevered child sleeping soundly behind them and the morning sun climbing over Silver Gulch's rooftops. And Joseph Garrison, who had spent 8 years building bridges in towns he never let himself call home, felt, for the first time in all those years, something inside himself finally come to rest. They rode back to Ruby Flat 2 days later, once Doc Malone had assured Ida the worst of the fever had passed through the district and would not return, and found Marshal Hayes still there, waiting patiently with the $400 still sitting, untouched, in the land office's strongbox, where he had locked it away for safekeeping the moment Joseph had ridden out. Wells Fargo does not much care what order a man collects his reward, so long as he collects it eventually, Hayes said, sliding the stack of bills across the table once more. I judged you'd be back for it when the fever business was settled, Mr. Garrison, and I judged right. Joseph looked at the money for a long moment, and then at Ida standing beside him, and this time when he took it, there was no hesitation in his hand at all, because he understood now, in a way he had not fully understood before, that choosing love over money did not mean a man must live forever without either, only that he must know, in the moment it counted, which one he could not live without. What will you do with it? Ida asked, as they walked out of the land office together into the cool autumn afternoon, the whole valley smelling of wood smoke and drying hay. Buy the parcel of land above the orchard, Joseph said. The one Everett Bancroft mentioned needs a house built on it before winter. Mill lumber from Silver Gulch, stone from the canyon I know better than any man alive now, and enough left over, perhaps, to hire a man to help me raise it before the first snow. He glanced at her, feeling suddenly, foolishly nervous in a way that 8 years of hunting dangerous men had never once made him feel. I do not suppose the valley's only midwife would consider making that house something more than a bachelor's shelter against the winter. Ida stopped walking, turning to face him fully in the middle of the dusty street, her eyes bright with something that was equal parts laughter and tears. Are you asking me to marry you, Joseph Garrison, in the middle of Ruby Flat's Main Street, 3 days after nearly drowning both of us twice in the same canyon ford? I have found, Joseph said, echoing her own words back to her with a small, hopeful smile, that the men who wait for a more convenient moment rarely find one at all. I would rather ask you now plainly, and let the whole town hear it, than wait for some better occasion that may never arrive. Then yes, Ida said, laughing now, the tears spilling over freely. Yes, Joseph Garrison, I will marry you, though I expect you to build me a proper birthing room in that house, with good light and a stove that draws well, because I do not intend to stop delivering this valley's children merely because I have finally found a home of my own to return to. I would not dream of asking you to stop, Joseph said, pulling her close, heedless of the farmers and freight drivers watching openly from the boardwalk. This valley needs you exactly as you are, Ida Bancroft. I have simply been fortunate enough to need you a little more than the rest of them. The bridge over Coyote Wash was finished by the first week of November, its stone footings sunk deep into bedrock, its timber span reinforced with iron freighted up at last from Carson City, strong enough, Joseph promised the town council, to stand through 50 years of flood seasons without so much as a groan of protest. The town held a small celebration the day the last plank was laid, Everett Bancroft cutting a ribbon strung across its near end, with more ceremony than the occasion probably required, and children from both Ruby Flat and Silver Gulch ran back and forth across the new span, shrieking with delight at a crossing that no longer depended on luck and a dangerous ford. Beside the bridge, at Joseph's insistence, and with the full agreement of the newly reformed town council, a shared flume was built as well, its headgate fitted with a proper measured weir that split the spring's flow by careful, fair proportion between Ruby Flat's orchards and Silver Gulch's mill, a design Joseph had worked out over long evenings with Everett Bancroft and the mill's newly appointed, far more reasonable manager. so that neither town would ever again have cause to accuse the other of taking more than its rightful share. It was, Joseph liked to say afterward, the truest bridge he had ever built, though it carried water instead of wagons. When the crowd finally dispersed that evening, the lanterns strung along the new bridge's railing burning low, the fiddle music from an impromptu celebration fading back toward the warehouse, Joseph and Ida lingered alone at the center of the span, looking down at the water running clean and orderly beneath them, where a flood had once torn everything apart. "Do you remember?" Ida said softly, leaning against the new railing, "standing right about here, arguing with me about whether I ought to drown myself trying to save Sarah Whitfield's life?" "I remember," Joseph said, thinking that I had never in my life seen anyone so certain of what mattered, and so entirely unwilling to let danger talk her out of it. "I believe I fell a little in love with you before we had even finished crossing that ford the first time, though it took me rather longer to admit it, even to myself." "And I believe," Ida said, "that I fell in love with a man who knew every hidden path through a dangerous canyon, and chose, in the end, to use that knowledge only to save people, rather than to hunt them, and who left $400 sitting on a table without a second thought because a sick child mattered more." "It was never a difficult choice," Joseph said, drawing her close against the cool evening air, the whole valley quiet and settled around them, the mill's distant lamps and the farmhouse's scattered windows glowing softly in the dusk. "You are the first home I have ever wanted badly enough to build one and stay inside it, Ida Bancroft. Bounty money comes and goes." "This," he said, gesturing at the bridge beneath their feet, at the lights of both towns visible now in the gathering dark at her, standing warm and certain in the circle of his arm, "this is the only thing I have ever built that I never intend to leave." Ida tilted her face up to his, the last light fading gold over the western ridges, the whole hard, dangerous, beautiful week finally, fully behind them. "Then build it well, Joseph Garrison," she said, "because I intend to spend the rest of my life standing right here beside you while you do." He kissed her there on the new bridge, with the water running steady and shared beneath them, and neither one of them, for the first time in either of their long and wandering lives, felt any need at all to be anywhere else.